Jake Morrison stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around his schedule. At 32, he had built a successful tech startup in Silicon Valley, and this trip to London was supposed to be a quick business venture mixed with some sightseeing. His expensive sneakers squeaked against the terminal floor as he dragged his oversized suitcase, already complaining loudly into his phone about the delay. "Yeah, Mom, I'm finally here. This place is so old-fashioned. Everything takes forever," he said, his voice carrying across the arrival hall. Several British passengers glanced his way, noting his loud American accent and dismissive tone. Jake didn't notice or care. He was used to being the center of attention. The taxi ride into central London only reinforced his initial impressions. The buildings looked ancient to him. The streets seemed narrow compared to the wide boulevards of Los Angeles, and he couldn't understand why people weren't moving faster. He spent the entire journey on social media, posting stories about how quaint everything looked, complete with eye-rolling emojis. His hotel in Covent Garden was perfectly located for both business and pleasure. Jake had specifically chosen it because it was walking distance from all the major tourist attractions. He planned to knock out the sightseeing quickly so he could focus on his meetings with potential investors. Time was money, and Jake Morrison didn't like wasting either. After checking in and freshening up, Jake decided to start with the most obvious destination, Buckingham Palace. He'd heard about the famous guards and their funny hats, and thought it would make for some great content for his social media followers. The walk through St. James's Park was pleasant enough, though he spent most of it on his phone, barely glancing at the scenery. When he finally arrived at the palace gates, Jake was immediately struck by the crowds of tourists. People from all over the world were gathered behind the black and gold railings, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard ceremony. The atmosphere was respectful, almost reverent, as visitors whispered quietly among themselves. Jake pushed through the crowd with little regard for personal space, his expensive camera equipment bumping into other tourists. "Excuse me, coming through," he announced loudly, not really waiting for people to move. An elderly British couple frowned at his behavior, but Jake was oblivious to their disapproval. The palace itself was impressive, even to someone as cynically minded as Jake. The Victorian facade gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the famous balcony where royal family members made their appearances was clearly visible. But what really caught his attention were the guards stationed at their posts. These weren't just any guards. These were the Queen's Guard, though Jake didn't know the proper terminology. To him, they were simply the guys in the red uniforms with the tall black hats. He'd seen them in movies and postcards, but seeing them in person was different. They stood perfectly still, their faces expressionless beneath their bearskin caps, their red tunics immaculate despite the London weather. "This is perfect," Jake muttered to himself, pulling out his phone. He started recording a video, narrating loudly enough for half the crowd to hear. "So here I am at Buckingham Palace, looking at these guards who apparently just stand there all day doing nothing. I mean, what's the point? It's 2026, not 1826. This whole thing seems like such a waste of taxpayer money." A few tourists turned to look at him, some shaking their heads in disapproval. A family from Germany moved away from him, clearly uncomfortable with his loud commentary. But Jake was just getting started. He began walking closer to one of the guard posts, his phone still recording. The guard in question was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, standing at attention with his rifle. His bearskin cap added at least a foot to his height, making him an imposing figure. Despite the crowds and noise around him, the guard remained perfectly motionless, staring straight ahead. "Look at this guy," Jake continued his commentary, now speaking directly to his phone's camera. "He's just standing there like a statue. I bet he can't even move. Watch this." He started making faces at the guard, waving his hands dramatically, trying to get a reaction. When that failed to produce results, he moved even closer. The crowd around him was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. A British woman with her 2 children quietly moved them away from Jake's vicinity. A group of Japanese tourists looked confused by his behavior, whispering among themselves in their native language. Jake, however, was enjoying himself. To him, this was entertainment. He'd grown up in a culture where everything was content, where every experience needed to be shared and amplified for maximum impact. The idea that these guards were real soldiers with real duties didn't occur to him. They were just props for his social media show. He started calling out to the guard, his voice getting louder and more obnoxious. "Hey, Redcoat, can you hear me? Do you ever smile? What happens if I touch you?" The questions came rapid fire, each one more inappropriate than the last. An older gentleman with a distinguished bearing approached Jake. He wore a well-tailored coat and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to respect. "Excuse me, young man," he said politely but firmly. "But perhaps you could show a bit more respect. These are real soldiers doing their duty." Jake barely glanced at the man. "Oh, come on, Grandpa. They're just for show. This whole thing is just tourist theater." He turned back to the guard, now less than 3 feet away from him. "Seriously, what do you actually do? Stand there and look pretty?" The distinguished gentleman's expression hardened. "I think you misunderstand the nature of their service, son." "Service?" Jake laughed, loud enough to draw attention from across the courtyard. "What service? Standing around in a costume? I mean, I get it, it's traditional or whatever, but let's be real here. This isn't exactly protecting anyone." What Jake didn't know, and what the crowd around him was beginning to realize, was that he was about to learn a very important lesson about respect, tradition, and the real meaning of service. The distinguished gentleman watching his performance wasn't just another tourist. His name was Colonel Sir William Hartwell, retired, and he had spent 40 years serving in the British Army before taking on a role as a historical consultant for the royal household. The guard Jake was harassing wasn't just a ceremonial figure either. Guardsman Thomas Bennett had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Welsh Guards before taking on his current posting. The rifle he carried wasn't just for show, and his training was as current and rigorous as any frontline soldiers. But Jake Morrison, successful entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, didn't know any of this. He was about to get an education in British military history, royal protocol, and the true meaning of honor that would change his entire perspective on what he was witnessing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach an arrogant American tourist that some traditions run deeper than his shallow understanding could fathom. The Queen's Guard had stood their post through wars, celebrations, tragedies, and triumphs for centuries. They had faced down enemies far more dangerous than one loudmouth tourist. Jake Morrison was about to discover that disrespecting the Crown's guardians came with consequences he never could have imagined. His phone was still recording as he prepared to cross a line that would transform his simple sightseeing trip into an unforgettable lesson in humility and respect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Jake raised his hand toward the motionless guard, completely unaware that his next action would set in motion a series of events that would be talked about for years to come. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Colonel Hartwell stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. This young American was about to learn that some lines should never be crossed, and some institutions deserve nothing but the highest respect. The education of Jake Morrison was about to begin. Jake's hand was inches away from the guard's red tunic when Colonel Hartwell's firm voice cut through the air like a blade. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, young man." Jake spun around, irritated by the interruption. "Look, old-timer, I'm just having a bit of fun here. Nobody's getting hurt." He gestured dismissively at the motionless guard. "Besides, what's he going to do? He can't even move." The colonel stepped closer, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, sensing drama unfolding. Phones were being pulled out, though most tourists were respectful enough to keep their recording discreet, unlike Jake's loud and obnoxious display. "That guard," Colonel Hartwell said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, "is Guardsman Bennett of the Welsh Guards. He has served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he earned a commendation for valor under fire. He is currently performing one of the most honored duties in the British military. And you, sir, are making a fool of yourself." Jake's expression shifted from annoyance to skepticism. "Afghanistan? Come on, this guy's just a tourist attraction. Look at the costume he's wearing. That's not real military gear." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Several British tourists looked genuinely offended by Jake's dismissive attitude. The colonel's eyes flashed with anger, but he maintained his composure. "That costume, as you call it, is the dress uniform of one of the most elite regiments in the British Army. The Welsh Guards have served with distinction since 1915. They fought at the Somme, at Normandy, in the Falklands, and in Afghanistan. That bearskin cap represents over a century of courage and sacrifice." Jake rolled his eyes dramatically for his phone camera, which he was still holding up to record everything. Okay, I get it. Military history is important to you guys. But, seriously, standing around in front of a palace? How is that serving anyone?" What Jake didn't realize was that his loud, disrespectful behavior had attracted the attention of more than just tourists. Two Metropolitan Police officers had noticed the commotion and were making their way through the crowd. Additionally, the duty officer from the guard room had been quietly informed that there was a situation developing at one of the sentry posts. Colonel Hartwell decided it was time for a proper education. "You want to know what real service looks like, Mr. Morrison?" "Jake Morrison," he replied, puffing out his chest slightly. "I run a tech company in California. We're worth about $50 million. "Well, Mr. Morrison," the colonel continued, unimpressed by the financial boasting, "let me tell you what these guards really do. They're not just ceremonial. These men are active-duty soldiers who could be deployed to combat zones at any time. When they're not standing guard here, they're training for warfare, conducting security operations, or serving overseas." Jake was becoming increasingly frustrated by the interruption to his social media content. "Look, I appreciate the history lesson, but I came here to see the sights, not get lectured by some random old guy." "Random old guy?" The colonel's eyebrows raised. "I'm Colonel Sir William Hartwell, OB. I spent 4 decades serving Her Majesty, including 3 years as commanding officer of the Coldstream Guards. I think I'm qualified to speak about military tradition." The crowd around them had grown significantly. What started as casual sightseeing had turned into an impromptu education session. Many of the tourists were genuinely interested in what the colonel was saying, having never understood the true nature of the Queen's Guard themselves. Jake, however, remained stubbornly unimpressed. "Okay, so you're military too. That's great. But this is 2026. We don't need people standing around palaces anymore. It's inefficient. In Silicon Valley, we'd have replaced these guys with security cameras and motion sensors years ago." The absurdity of his statement caused several people in the crowd to gasp audibly. A woman with a British accent spoke up. "You can't be serious. Replace the Queen's Guard with cameras." "Why not?" Jake shot back, now addressing the growing audience. "It's cheaper, more effective, and you don't have to pay people to stand around doing nothing all day. It's basic economics." Colonel Hartwell shook his head slowly. "Mr. Morrison, you're missing the point entirely. This isn't about economics. It's about tradition, honor, and the continuity of our constitutional monarchy. These guards represent something far more valuable than efficiency metrics." Jake laughed mockingly. "Constitutional monarchy? Dude, it's 2026. Kings and queens are basically just celebrities now. They don't actually do anything important." The crowd's reaction was immediate and negative. Several British tourists looked genuinely angry, while international visitors seemed shocked by Jake's casual dismissal of the royal family. The two police officers who had been approaching finally reached the edge of the crowd. "Everything all right here?" one of them asked, his tone professional but concerned. Colonel Hartwell nodded toward Jake. "This gentleman seems to be under the impression that Her Majesty's Guard are merely decorative. I was attempting to provide some historical context." The police officer glanced at Jake, taking in his expensive clothes, his phone still recording, and his obvious American accent. "Sir, I hope you understand that while you're welcome to visit and observe, any interference with the Guard is a serious offense." Jake's confidence wavered slightly for the first time. "Interference? I was just asking questions. This is still a free country, right?" "Indeed it is," the officer replied calmly. "But there are laws regarding the obstruction of military personnel in the performance of their duties. The Guard are working soldiers, not tourist attractions." Meanwhile, Guardsman Bennett continued to stand at perfect attention, seemingly oblivious to the drama unfolding mere feet away. His discipline was absolute, his focus unwavering. He had been trained to ignore distractions, to maintain his post regardless of weather, noise, or disruption. This training had served him well in the mountains of Afghanistan, and it served him well now in dealing with an obnoxious tourist. Colonel Hartwell decided to take a different approach. "Mr. Morrison, perhaps you'd be interested in learning what the Guard actually does when they're not on ceremonial duty? It might change your perspective." Jake shrugged, still recording but now slightly less confident with police officers present. "Sure, whatever. But I still think this whole thing is outdated." "The Welsh Guards," the colonel began, his voice carrying easily through the crowd, "recently returned from a deployment in Estonia, where they were part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. They've served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, and Northern Ireland. When they're not on operational deployment, they conduct counter-terrorism training, ceremonial duties, and public engagement activities." He gestured toward the motionless guard. "Guardsman Bennett here has completed urban warfare training, desert operations courses, and advanced marksmanship qualifications. That rifle he's carrying isn't just for show. These men are prepared to defend this palace, and by extension the crown, with their lives if necessary. Jake's phone was still recording, but his commentary had become noticeably less confident. Okay, so they do real military stuff too. I get that. But the standing around in costume part still seems. Seems what? Interrupted a new voice. The crowd turned to see a tall, elegant woman in her 60s approaching. She wore a simple but expensive coat and carried herself with unmistakable authority. I'm sorry, I couldn't help overhearing. Did you just refer to the uniform of the Welsh Guards as a costume? Colonel Hartwell immediately straightened and nodded respectfully. Lady Margaret, I was just explaining to this young American gentleman about the role of the Guard. Lady Margaret smiled politely at Jake, but her eyes held a steely determination. How fascinating. And what, may I ask, is your expertise in military matters, young man? Jake was beginning to sense that he was outnumbered, but his natural arrogance prevented him from backing down. I don't need to be a military expert to see when something's inefficient. I'm a businessman. I understand value and productivity. I see, Lady Margaret replied coolly. And, in your business expertise, you've determined that centuries of British military tradition constitute inefficiency? The crowd was now entirely focused on the conversation. What had started as one tourist's obnoxious behavior had evolved into a clash of cultures and values. Jake represented a certain type of modern American pragmatism, while the growing group of British voices represented tradition, respect, and institutional continuity. Jake was about to respond when his phone buzzed with a notification. Without thinking, he glanced at it, breaking eye contact with Lady Margaret. The gesture was small, but it perfectly encapsulated his priorities. Even in the middle of a serious conversation about history and tradition, his attention was diverted by social media. Colonel Hartwell noticed the gesture and shook his head sadly. This, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely the problem. A complete inability to focus on anything beyond the immediate and superficial. Jake looked up from his phone, irritated. Hey, that's not fair. I'm listening. I just got a message from my business partner. During a conversation about the sacrifice of British soldiers, Lady Margaret's voice carried a note of genuine disappointment. How illuminating. The police officers exchanged glances. While Jake hadn't technically broken any laws yet, his behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. The crowd was growing larger, and his loud, disrespectful commentary was clearly causing distress to other visitors. Jake suddenly realized that this confrontation was not going the way he had planned. What was supposed to be entertaining content for his social media followers had turned into a public examination of his character and values. The confident entrepreneur from Silicon Valley was beginning to feel very out of his depth in the face of British tradition and military honor. But Jake Morrison was not someone who backed down easily. His success in business had come from his willingness to challenge established norms and push boundaries. Unfortunately, he was about to learn that some boundaries existed for very good reasons, and that some challenges were not welcome in polite society. The stage was set for an even more dramatic confrontation as Jake prepared to double down on his disrespectful behavior, unaware that he was about to cross a line that would have serious consequences for his remaining time in London. That Jake's frustration was mounting. What had started as a fun social media opportunity was turning into an unexpected confrontation with what seemed like half of Britain. He decided to regain control of the situation by being even more provocative. You know what? Jake announced loudly, addressing his phone camera while gesturing at the assembled crowd. This perfectly illustrates the difference between America and the UK. We focus on innovation and progress, while you guys are stuck worshipping the past. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several British tourists looked genuinely angry, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. Colonel Hartwell's jaw tightened, and Lady Margaret's polite smile vanished completely. Worshipping the past? Lady Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. You think honoring the sacrifice of those who died defending freedom is worship? Jake, emboldened by what he perceived as a successful provocation, continued his rant. Look, I respect that people died in wars and stuff. That's tragic. But keeping guys in funny hats standing around a palace isn't honoring anyone. It's just expensive theater for tourists. A middle-aged man in a veteran's jacket pushed forward through the crowd. His face was red with anger, and a small pin on his collar identified him as a Falklands War veteran. Expensive theater, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. My best mate died defending these islands. These guards carry on his tradition. How dare you call it theater? Jake was completely unprepared for the raw emotion in the veteran's voice. He had expected academic debate, not personal pain. For the first time since arriving at the palace, his confidence wavered noticeably. Colonel Hartwell stepped between Jake and the veteran, sensing the potential for real confrontation. Perhaps, Mr. Morrison, it's time you understood exactly what you're criticizing. The guards don't just stand here for show. They represent an unbroken chain of service dating back centuries. Centuries of what, exactly? Jake shot back, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. Centuries of men dying for principles you apparently don't understand, Lady Margaret interjected sharply. The Coldstream Guards fought at Waterloo against Napoleon. The Grenadier Guards stormed the beaches at Normandy. The Welsh Guards bled in the trenches of the Somme. Every regiment represented here has earned its place through blood and sacrifice. Jake looked around at the crowd, suddenly, realizing that many of the faces staring back at him held genuine anger. These weren't just random tourists annoyed by his rudeness. These were people who felt personally insulted by his dismissive attitude towards something they held sacred. Okay, fine, he said, trying to regain his composure. I get that there's history here, but it's still just symbolism. In the real world, what does any of this actually accomplish? Colonel Hartwell exchanged a meaningful look with Lady Margaret, then nodded as if reaching a decision. Very well, Mr. Morrison. Since you're so concerned with practical accomplishments, let me tell you exactly what the Guard accomplished just last month. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Even Jake lowered his phone slightly, curious despite himself. 3 weeks ago, the colonel began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. During a state visit by the president of Estonia, intelligence services detected a credible terrorist threat against Buckingham Palace. The Guard, working with So-1 Protection Command, identified and neutralized the threat before it could develop. Jake's skepticism was evident. Come on, that sounds like something out of a movie. You're telling me these guys in the fancy uniforms are actually counterterrorism agents? I'm telling you, Colonel Hartwell replied with steel in his voice. That Guardsman Bennett, the man you've been mocking for the past 20 minutes, was one of 3 soldiers who provided crucial intelligence that prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on foreign dignitaries. The crowd stirred with interest and pride. This was clearly news to most of them as well. Jake, however, remained skeptical. Prove it, he said challengingly. Lady Margaret stepped forward. I beg your pardon. Prove it, Jake repeated. Show me evidence that any of this actually happened. Anyone can make up stories about secret missions and terrorist threats. The silence that followed was deafening. Several people in the crowd looked shocked at Jake's audacity. Colonel Hartwell's face had turned a deep shade of red, while Lady Margaret appeared to be calculating her response very carefully. Mr. Morrison, she said finally, her voice carrying a weight that Jake was only beginning to understand. Are you suggesting that I am lying to you? Something in her tone made Jake pause. For the first time since the confrontation began, he sensed that he might be making a serious mistake. I'm just saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's basic logic. Basic logic, Lady Margaret repeated slowly. How refreshing to meet someone so committed to evidence and logic. She reached into her purse and withdrew what appeared to be an official government identification card. Perhaps this will satisfy your requirements for proof. Jake squinted at the ID, trying to read it from a distance. What he saw made his blood run cold. The card bore the insignia of the Cabinet Office, and Lady Margaret's title was listed as Permanent Secretary to the Cabinet Secretary. Colonel Hartwell noticed Jake's reaction and smiled grimly. Lady Margaret Thornberry is one of the most senior civil servants in Her Majesty's government. She has direct access to classified intelligence briefings and serves as a liaison between the military and the Prime Minister's office. Jake's throat went dry. He had been arguing with someone who was essentially the British equivalent of a senior White House official. Worse, he had accused her of lying about national security matters while being filmed on his own phone. I didn't know. He stammered. No, Lady Margaret agreed coldly. You didn't know. You assumed. You made judgments about people and institutions you don't understand, based on nothing more than your own prejudices and ignorance. The crowd was now completely silent. Even the veteran who had been angry earlier was watching with fascination as Jake's arrogance crumbled in real time. Lady Margaret continued her devastating critique. You assume that because you've built a successful business, you understand efficiency and value. You assume that because you're American, you represent progress and innovation. You assume that because something appears ceremonial to your untrained eye, it must be meaningless. Jake wanted to defend himself, but found that words were failing him. Every assumption Lady Margaret listed was exactly what he had been thinking. But, most importantly, she continued, you assumed that your ignorance was equivalent to knowledge, and that your opinion carried weight simply because you held it strongly. Colonel Hartwell stepped forward again. The guard you've been mocking, Mr. Morrison, are currently responsible for the security of several foreign dignitaries staying at the palace. They coordinate with MI5, SO1, and International Security Services. They undergo regular training in counter-surveillance, threat assessment, and close protection duties. Jake's phone was still recording, but he had completely forgotten about his social media audience. The confident entrepreneur who had arrived at Buckingham Palace an hour earlier was nowhere to be found. Furthermore, Lady Margaret added, your behavior this afternoon has been observed and noted by palace security. Your dismissive comments about the royal family, your attempts to interfere with a serving soldier, and your general disrespect for British institutions have all been documented. The implications of her words were slowly sinking in. Jake realized that what he had thought was harmless tourist behavior might actually have serious consequences. One of the police officers who had been quietly observing stepped forward. Sir, I think it might be advisable for you to move along now. Perhaps consider your behavior more carefully during the remainder of your visit. Jake looked around at the crowd of faces staring at him. Where he had expected to see tourist amusement at his antics, he saw disappointment, anger, and genuine hurt. These people weren't upset because he had challenged their traditions. They were upset because he had shown profound disrespect for something sacred to them. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Morrison found himself completely out of his depth. His business success, his confidence, his American bravado, none of it meant anything here. He was just an ignorant tourist who had made a fool of himself in front of some of the most important people in Britain. But the lesson was far from over. Lady Margaret and Colonel Hartwell had more to teach him about respect, tradition, and the true meaning of service. Jake was about to discover that his education in British values had only just begun. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the courtyard. In that golden light, Guardsman Bennett continued his silent vigil, a living symbol of everything Jake had failed to understand. The tourist who had come to mock was about to become the one being schooled in a lesson he would never forget. Jake stood in stunned silence as the weight of his situation began to sink in. Lady Margaret's identification card was still visible in her hand, a stark reminder that he had just spent the last half hour arguing with one of the most powerful people in the British government. The crowd around him had grown even larger, and he could see phones discreetly recording from multiple angles. Colonel Hartwell seemed to sense Jake's internal struggle and decided to press forward with the education. Mr. Morrison, since you're so interested in practical value and modern relevance, perhaps you'd like to understand how the guard system actually works in the 21st century. Jake nodded weakly, no longer trusting his voice to remain steady. The household division consists of 7 regiments. The colonel began, his tone shifting from confrontational to instructional. 5 foot guard regiments and 2 mounted regiments. They rotate through various duties, ceremonial, operational, and training cycles. What you see here is just one small part of a much larger military organization. Lady Margaret stepped forward, her government ID now safely tucked away. The intelligence value alone of having highly trained soldiers in tourist areas cannot be overstated. They observe, they listen, they report. Do you have any idea how many potential security threats have been identified by guardsmen simply doing their ceremonial duties? Jake shook his head, genuinely curious now despite his embarrassment. Last year alone, she continued, guards at various royal residences provided crucial early warnings about suspicious individuals, unusual surveillance attempts, and potential security breaches. They're not just standing there looking pretty, Mr. Morrison. They're working. An elderly woman in the crowd spoke up for the first time. My grandson serves with the Coldstream Guards. He's been to Afghanistan twice. When he stands guard here, he tells me it's the proudest moment of his service. To think that someone would call that expensive theater. She shook her head sadly. The veteran who had confronted Jake earlier had calmed down but remained focused on the conversation. You want to know about value? He asked Jake directly. When I came back from the Falklands, I couldn't sleep for months. PTSD, they call it now. Seeing the guards here, knowing that tradition was still alive, that the sacrifice meant something, that helped me heal. That's not something you can put in a business plan. Jake felt a lump forming in his throat. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. These were real people sharing personal experiences. His phone was still recording, but he had long since forgotten about creating content for his followers. Colonel Hartwell gestured toward Guardsman Bennett, who remained motionless at his post. That young man has been standing there for nearly 2 hours. He'll remain there for another hour before being relieved. During that time, he maintains constant awareness of his surroundings, watches for potential threats, and represents the crown with absolute dignity. But what does he actually do? Jake asked, his question now coming from genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. He observes everything, Lady Margaret explained. The faces in the crowd, unusual behavior patterns, potential security risks. He's trained to identify surveillance attempts, to spot concealed weapons, to recognize the signs of someone planning an attack, all while maintaining the appearance of ceremonial duty. A man with a slight German accent joined the conversation. I'm a security consultant from Berlin. I have studied your system extensively. The combination of visible deterrent and covert intelligence gathering is remarkably sophisticated. Many countries try to copy it, but lack the training discipline to make it effective. Jake looked around the crowd with new eyes. These weren't just random tourists anymore. They were people with expertise, experience, and deep knowledge of the subjects he had dismissed so casually. Colonel Hartwell continued the education. The bearskin caps you mocked earlier? They're made from the fur of Canadian black bears. Each cap represents a tradition dating back to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, when the Grenadier Guards defeated Napoleon's Imperial Guard and adopted their distinctive headgear as a trophy of victory. The red tunics, Lady Margaret added, are designed to be visible from great distances, allowing commanders to identify their troops on battlefields. The gold braiding indicates rank and regiment. Every detail has meaning, history, and practical purpose. Jake was beginning to understand that his surface-level observations had missed layers upon layers of meaning and functionality. I had no idea, he admitted quietly. Of course you didn't, the colonel replied, though his tone was less harsh than before. These things aren't obvious to casual observers. That's rather the point. The most effective security often appears to be something else entirely. A young woman who had been listening intently spoke up. I'm studying international relations at Cambridge. We learn about soft power and cultural diplomacy. The Queen's Guard are one of Britain's most effective tools for both. They project stability, tradition, and strength without appearing threatening. Jake's business mind was finally beginning to grasp the complexity of what he was observing. So it's like layered functionality? Multiple purposes served by a single system. Exactly, Lady Margaret confirmed. Tourism revenue, security services, diplomatic messaging, military training, and cultural preservation all in one institution. From a purely economic standpoint, the return on investment is quite remarkable. The veteran stepped forward again. And that doesn't even touch on the most important part, what it means to the soldiers themselves and to the people who believe in what they represent. Colonel Hartwell nodded gravely. Service, Mr. Morrison. That's a concept that seems to have been lost in your world of metrics and efficiency. These men serve something greater than themselves. They stand for hours in all weather, maintaining perfect discipline, because they understand that they represent the crown, the nation, and centuries of those who came before them. Jake felt a strange sensation he wasn't used to experiencing. Shame. Not embarrassment at being caught in a mistake, but genuine shame at having mocked something he now understood to be genuinely noble. The Queen's Guard have stood their posts through the Blitz, Lady Margaret continued. They maintained their duties during IRA terrorist campaigns. They adapted to new threats after September 11th. They've evolved constantly while maintaining their essential character. When people around the world think of Britain, the German consultant added, they think of these guards. It's one of your most powerful symbols. To dismiss it as outdated shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how cultural influence works in international relations. Jake looked again at Guardsman Bennett, still motionless at his post. For the first time, he saw not a costumed actor, but a professional soldier performing a duty that combined military service, cultural representation, and security work in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. I owe him an apology, Jake said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. Indeed you do, Colonel Hartwell agreed. But not just to him. To everyone who serves, everyone who has served, and everyone who understands what service means. Lady Margaret's expression softened slightly. The fact that you can recognize that suggests there's hope for you yet, Mr. Morrison. But Jake's education was far from complete. He had learned about the functionality and meaning of the Guard, but he had yet to understand the deeper principles of respect, tradition, and humility that truly underlay British culture. The most important lessons were still to come. As the afternoon light continued to fade, Jake Morrison, successful entrepreneur and confident American, found himself facing a choice. He could retreat into his original assumptions and dismiss everything he had learned, or he could accept that he had been profoundly wrong about something important. The crowd watched him wrestle with this decision, sensing that they were witnessing a moment of potential transformation. Whether that transformation would actually occur remained to be seen. Guardsman Bennett continued his silent vigil, unaware that the tourist who had come to mock him was slowly learning to see him as he truly was, a guardian of tradition, a servant of the crown, and a keeper of honor in an often cynical world. The lesson was deepening, but the most powerful part was yet to come. The evening air was growing cooler as Jake stood before Guardsman Bennett, struggling with emotions he hadn't experienced in years. The confident entrepreneur who had arrived at Buckingham Palace hours earlier felt like a stranger to him now. In his hand, his phone continued recording, but the content being captured was nothing like what he had planned. "I need to apologize," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just to him, but to everyone I've offended today." Colonel Hartwell studied Jake's face carefully. "Recognizing the need to apologize is the first step, Mr. Morrison. But do you understand why you need to apologize? Or are you simply embarrassed at being corrected?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking at the motionless guard. I think I've been seeing the world through a very narrow lens. Everything had to fit into my definition of value and efficiency. I never considered that there might be other ways to measure worth." Lady Margaret's expression showed a flicker of approval. "That's a remarkably honest admission from someone in your position." "My position?" Jake asked. "Successful, wealthy, accustomed to being right," she explained. "In my experience, people in such positions rarely admit to being fundamentally wrong about anything." The crowd around them had been listening intently to this exchange. Many of the faces that had shown anger earlier now displayed curiosity and something approaching respect for Jake's apparent willingness to learn. The elderly woman whose grandson served with the Coldstream Guards stepped forward. "Young man, what you said earlier about the Guards being expensive theater, that hurt deeply. My family has served the crown for 4 generations. My grandfather died at Passchendaele wearing this same uniform." To hear it dismissed so casually, Jake turned to face her, and she could see genuine remorse in his eyes. "Ma'am, I had no right to diminish something so important to you and your family. I was ignorant, and I spoke without thinking about who might be listening or who might be hurt by my words." "The fact that you can say that shows character," she replied. "Many people double down on their mistakes rather than admit them." Colonel Hartwell decided it was time for the final lesson. "Mr. Morrison, you've learned about the practical functions of the Guard, their history, and their modern relevance. But there's one more thing you need to understand: the concept of duty without glory." Jake looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I follow." Guardsman Bennett will complete his duty today having been mocked, insulted, and treated as a tourist attraction by someone who had no understanding of what he represents. He couldn't defend himself, couldn't speak back, couldn't even acknowledge that he heard you. That takes a special kind of strength. "He just took it," Jake said, understanding dawning on his face. "He took it because that's what the job requires," Lady Margaret explained. "Not every aspect of service involves glory or recognition. Sometimes it means standing silent while ignorant people mock what you hold sacred." The veteran who had confronted Jake earlier spoke up again, his anger now replaced by something approaching sympathy. "That's what I couldn't make you understand before. It's not about the pageantry or the traditions by themselves. It's about the willingness to serve something greater than yourself, even when that service is difficult or thankless." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes, something that hadn't happened to him since childhood. "I've spent my whole career thinking that if something didn't make immediate, obvious sense, it was worthless. I never considered that my perspective might be limited." "Perspective is everything," the German consultant observed. "In my country, we learned painful lessons about what happens when tradition and honor are dismissed as outdated concepts. Sometimes the old ways exist for very good reasons." The young Cambridge student joined the conversation again. "What strikes me about this whole interaction is how it represents 2 different worldviews. One that sees everything through the lens of immediate utility and efficiency, and another that values continuity, sacrifice, and service to something beyond individual success." Jake nodded slowly. "And I was completely blind to the second worldview. I thought my way of seeing things was the only rational way." "That's a very American attitude," Lady Margaret observed, though not unkindly. "Your culture values disruption and innovation, which has produced remarkable achievements. But it can also lead to a dismissal of anything that doesn't fit that paradigm. What do I do now? Jake asked, genuinely seeking guidance. How do I make this right? Colonel Hartwell considered the question carefully. First, you finish watching the changing of the guard with proper respect. Then, you take time to reflect on what you've learned. And, perhaps most importantly, you carry this understanding forward into future interactions with things you don't immediately understand. As if summoned by the colonel's words, the sound of approaching boots could be heard from the direction of the palace. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. This is your chance, Lady Margaret said quietly to Jake. Watch and learn. See if you can observe with different eyes than the ones you brought here. The crowd around them began to organize itself for the ceremony, but Jake found himself rooted to the spot in front of Guardsman Bennett. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped forward and addressed the motionless soldier. Guardsman Bennett, he said, his voice clear enough to be heard by everyone around him. I owe you an apology. I was disrespectful, ignorant, and wrong. You've served your country with honor, and you deserve better treatment than what I showed you today. I'm sorry. The guard, of course, didn't respond. But something in his bearing seemed to acknowledge the apology, a subtle shift that only those watching carefully would have noticed. Colonel Hartwell placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. That took courage, Mr. Morrison. Admitting error publicly is never easy. As the ceremony began, Jake watched with completely different eyes. He saw the precision of the movements, the pride in the soldier's bearing, the centuries of tradition embodied in every step. Where he had once seen outdated pageantry, he now saw living history. When Guardsman Bennett was finally relieved of his post, he marched away with the same perfect discipline he had maintained throughout his duty. Jake watched him go with a mixture of admiration and regret. Will I be able to speak to him? Jake asked Colonel Hartwell. To apologize properly? That's not typically how these things work, the colonel replied. But your public acknowledgement was heard by everyone here, and word travels quickly in military circles. He'll know. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Jake found himself reluctant to leave. This place had been the site of his humiliation, but also of his education. He felt fundamentally changed by the experience. Lady Margaret approached him one final time. Mr. Morrison, I hope you'll remember this lesson when you return to California. The world is full of things that have value beyond what can be measured on a spreadsheet. I will, Jake promised. And I'm going to delete that video I was making. It wouldn't be right to post it. Actually, she said with a slight smile, you might consider editing it thoughtfully. Your transformation today could be valuable for others to see. Sometimes the most powerful content is when someone admits they were wrong and explains what they learned. Jake looked at his phone, which was still recording. Hours of footage that began with arrogant mockery and ended with genuine humility and understanding. It wasn't the viral content he had planned, but it might be something more important. As he walked away from Buckingham Palace that evening, Jake Morrison was a different person than the one who had arrived that afternoon. He had learned about respect, tradition, and service. He had discovered that efficiency and innovation, while valuable, weren't the only measures of worth. Most importantly, he had learned that true strength sometimes means standing silent in the face of ignorance and disrespect. The lights of London twinkled around him as he made his way back to his hotel, carrying with him a lesson that would influence every business meeting, every international relationship, and every encounter with traditions he didn't immediately understand for the rest of his life. Behind him, Buckingham Palace stood as it had for centuries, guarded by men and women who understood that some things are worth preserving, protecting, and honoring, regardless of whether they make sense to the modern world. Jake Morrison had come to London as a tourist seeking content for social media. He was leaving as someone who understood that the most valuable things in life often can't be captured in a quick video or reduced to a simple explanation. The Queen's Guard had taught him their most important lesson, that true honor lies not in what you take from the world, but in what you're willing to give to it in service of something greater than yourself.